Hello, and welcome back to Book and Page. We are finally starting our final book for Season 2, Charles Williams' The Place of the Lion. I mentioned in our author profile we'll be doing a chapter for this, so for today we are reading Chapter 1, The Lioness. So, this is going to be fun, but let's start with a brief summary of what happens in this chapter before we get into things in a little more detail. So very briefly, we actually start the chapter out from the lioness's perspective. She's just hanging out, but she seems to sense something happening, and then we skip about a mile away to join Quentin and Anthony. They are hanging out on the side of a road waiting for a bus that hasn't come. They actually decide that they're going to go ahead and continue walking down the road and let the bus catch up with them. And as they do, it turns out these two like discussing things deeply. They were having an argument over lunch, but now they're talking about whether or not thoughts can be made to maps and how confusing that might be. This conversation, though, is cut off very quickly when they see ahead of them a bunch of lanterns. The lanterns, it turns out, are being held by a bunch of armed men. And Anthony and Quentin are kind of like, what's going on? It turns out the men are out hunting an escaped lioness. Oh, okay. And the reason why they've missed the bus is all the traffic in the area is being turned away due to the lioness. Quentin and Anthony say, yeah, that probably makes a lot of sense. And while they offer to help these gentlemen, they're actually sent further on down the road, saying that the main group at the main road would need them more. As they continue on, they try to distract themselves and end up revisiting the argument they've had over lunch about what's more dangerous, internal or external issues. They pause when they notice a house, and then, oh look, the lioness is behind them and coming for them. I would say external dangers, a little more dangerous right now. The two of them book it into the yard that they've just spotted and up to the house, but something at the door makes them hesitate, and they find themselves looking back at the lioness on the road. Now she seems to notice them in the yard, but perhaps she's noticed something else. It turns out there's a gentleman rhythmically pacing the yard, and this rhythmic pacing seems to catch both men and the lioness off guard, and they end up watching him for a while. However, when the man makes it to the pathway, and the men realize they can't call out to warn him, the lioness leaps the gate and goes at the dude. Things happen. Things happen, and the next thing you know, there is a lion roaring in the yard, who then continues on into the woods, leaving the unconscious man on the ground. Anthony finally brings himself to go and check on the man, and discovers he doesn't seem to be harmed, but he is still unconscious, but he can't move him. He tells Quentin he's going to check for a back door, and then hopefully they can move the gentleman inside, and a large group of men, all the searchers for the lioness, arrive to help them. The gentleman is Mr. Beringer, and his housekeeper is inside. However, when they try to move Mr. Beringer into the house, despite the fact that there are like 6 men lifting this dude, something doesn't want to seem to let them. It's Anthony shouting, "Oh, come on now!" That lets them get the dude into the house and upstairs to his bedroom. Now, Anthony does try to explain that he saw the lioness, but then there was a lion, and he's not believed. He does admit that it sounds silly, but he himself is sure it was a lion. Yeah, that's a way to start a story. First chapter. Woo! Okay, well, there's definitely some things that we can talk about. And one of the things we are going to have to address is why the first chapter starts with the lioness's perspective. But I personally think that that's something that we have to address other things happening before we can look back and try and figure out why we're starting with the lioness. So I think the really cool perspective we have to start with is Anthony and Quentin, and the philosophies we're already seeing differentiate between the two of them. time to do some readings. So, again, right on the first page, we do have this very brief section where it's the lioness, but very quickly we end up with Quentin and Anthony talking about the fact that the bus isn't here. And so, Anthony asks the question, shall we wander along and meet it? He's looking up the road from where the bus should have been. And Quentin suggests, or go on and let it catch us up, because that's the direction they're heading. And Anthony agrees. He says, logically, this makes sense. We'll do it that way. And they start walking the way they're headed so the bus can catch them. What's particularly interesting is then we are starting to see this already, and we'll see it more as we go through the story, that this is actually the philosophy they hold for practically everything else. Anthony is far more active in going out and... I was going to say, how do we... Yeah, wander along and meet it. Like, he's much more, let's go face the thing, we'll wander along and meet it, walk towards the problem, than necessarily walking away. And I say we're starting to see that because you'll notice, especially even in my summary, but especially if you read the full chapter, that Quentin almost disappears, and Anthony becomes the very clear leader of this situation. Once there's this whole strange moment in the yard where they have no idea what's happening, but the lioness disappears, Quentin's just kind of like... And Anthony's the one saying, okay, we need to go and check on this man. And he goes and checks on Mr. Beringer. He then comes back and says, I can't move him, but we have to get him inside. I'll go find if the back door will open. And he does so. He's the one also talking with the armed men. Quentin never seems to say anything past this point. Anthony is much more active in this sense. And Quentin, well, after the man is attacked by the lioness and the lion walks off, well, he does say something, which is, can we go? Anthony says we have to go and check on the gentleman, and Quentin responds, oh God, Anthony, let's get out of it, let's take the risk and run. And it's like, oh, you're just gonna leave the guy in the yard who's possibly just been mauled by a lion, lioness, maybe both of them? So what we actually have from the very beginning is a dichotomy happening. Anthony, who's willing to face the problems, and Quentin, who seems to be moving away from them. But the original dichotomy is a little more difficult than that. You'd think this is setting us up and telling us right away Anthony's right and Quentin's wrong. Except, in the original question of which way they should walk, Quentin says, well, we're going this way anyways, why don't we simply walk that way and let the bus catch up to us? And Anthony agrees that this is a logical choice. Williams here isn't letting us say, ah yes, face the problem, be the active Anthony. He is pointing out that there are probably points where it makes a lot more sense to continue on, and if something catches up with you, then something catches up with you, and you have to deal with it then. In fact, ultimately, it does mean that Quentin and Anthony end up walking right into the information that they need. Because they've continued walking along the road and end up meeting the armed men, they don't continue back and remain uninformed. So the dichotomy we actually start with, that throughout the chapter seems to play up the idea that facing and meeting your problems head on logically makes sense, well, we'll have to see how it pans out for everybody. And, of course, we have to admit that this isn't going to be an easy understanding argument. Can we understand Quentin freezing up when a lioness disappears and a lion shows up and, oh God, has that man been mauled? Yeah, I think most of us would understand freezing up there. Thankfully, Anthony is active, but Quentin's reaction makes sense. And Anthony seems to recognize that this is a possibility for his friend, that Quentin simply locked up. When he goes out to check the man, And when he goes around to see if the back door can be unlocked, he actually tells Quentin to shout if he sees anything. He repeats this instruction with a caveat. He says if you see anything, shout if you can. Quentin hasn't said much of anything up to this point, and Anthony recognizes his friend might be struggling. He doesn't really know what's happening, but there's also a question of whether or not you can do what you can do despite not knowing things, or whether you should stop and wait for more information. And admittedly, like I said, this complicates things immensely when you're not sure what's going on. Is Quentin waiting for more information? And does that make sense? This is especially true with what seems to be happening here. So, let's get into some spoilers and discuss what's supposed to be happening. That's starting right from the beginning. What happened with the lioness, and why is there a lion? Well, a strange thing is happening in England today. It seems that most of the normal items are disappearing from the world, and the platonic ideal is coming into the world. What's a platonic ideal? Well, that's complicated as well. Okay, best way to explain this. The philosopher Plato, who was Greek and in fact is one of the key older philosophers, the student of Socrates and the professor of Aristotle, Plato suggests that there is an ideal form for every item in the known universe. And this is both physical items, such as books, but also metaphysical items, such as truth and justice. Now, we can't necessarily imagine these things as physical. Let's take books, for example. What's the ideal form of a book? Well, books are all kind of the same, but they are different. Is the ideal form paperback or hardback? Does it have those scary edges that are all uneven? Are the edges painted? What story is written in the ideal book? You can't imagine it physically. And in fact, trying to imagine the ideal book really complicates things, even on the physical level. The usual suggestion I've seen is the ideal chair. Because again, a lot of chairs share the same features, but none of them are exactly the same. Is the ideal chair a rolling chair like what I'm sitting on? Is it a lazy boy? Is it just a normal chair with 4 legs and a back? Does it have armrests? It's simply the idea of the ideal chair. And everyone taps into that idea when creating a chair. When trying to write a novel or make a book, you are tapping into the ideal of bookishness. You are tapping into the ideal of chairness. Now, you can't always present it well, and in fact, any physical chair is never going to be the ideal form of a chair, but you try. And like I said, while books and the ideal book complicate things on the physical level, this becomes even more complicated when you get into metaphysical ideals. The ideal justice, the ideal truth, the ideal honesty. What is all of this? It's the idea that there is the grand perfect form somewhere in existence, and we all tap into that in trying to produce that thing. When you are trying to be just, you are tapping into the ideal form of justice and recreating it imperfectly. So what's happening here? Well, those platonic ideals and platonic forms are showing up in the world. And man, is Williams laying this on thick. The sheer number of times he uses the word form in the meeting between the lioness and Mr. Beringer is very intense. Again, why don't we go ahead and read some. It starts even before it becomes very intense, as they notice this man walking across the yard. We're noted From their right side came a man's form, pacing it as if in a slow abstraction. Oh, there's two real critical words for Platonic ideals: form and abstraction. The form is the abstract ideal thought of any physical or metaphysical item or idea. Let's skip down, though, to the point where the lioness seems to respond. There's a shout that seems to startle the lioness. The lioness, as if startled, made one leap over the gate, and her flying form seemed to collide with the man, just as he also began to take another rhythmical step. Forms and shadows twisted and mingled for 2 or 3 seconds in the middle of the garden. A tearing human cry began and ceased as if choked into silence. A snarl broke out and died swiftly into a similar stillness, and as if in answer to both of these sounds there came the roar of a lion. Not very loud, but as if subdued by distance rather than by mildness. With the roar the shadows settled, the garden became clear. Anthony and Quentin saw before them the form of a man lying on the ground, and standing over him the shape of a full-grown and tremendous lion, its head flung back, its mouth open, its body quivering. Let's add this next line, just to help paint this picture. It was a lion such as the young men had never seen in a zoo or menagerie. It was gigantic, and seemed to their dazed senses to be growing larger every moment. Of their presence it appeared unconscious. Awful and solitary it stood, and did not at first so much as turn its head. Then majestically it moved. It took up the slow forward pacing in the direction which the man had been following. It passed onward, and while they still stared at it, entered into the dark shadow of the trees and was hidden from sight. The man's form still lay prostrate. Of the lioness there was no sign. So again, William is telling us the forms, the Platonic forms, are important here. But I find a very interesting distinction. The use of form here seems to speak to the very physical being. The form of a man. Hi, the form of the lioness. Notably, the one creature involved in the scene that is not described as a form is the lion that appears out of nowhere, that is great and powerful, solitary and majestic, and seems to be growing larger even as they look at it. This is not a form, it is the ideal. Yeah. Ugh. This is why in my author bio I noted that a lot of people might want to divide William's writing groups up and put novels over here, and he's best known for his novels and his criticism, his poetry, and his theology, and his plays all separately, but you can't write a novel without all of that affecting your novel. So Williams is a very smart gentleman who's aware of the Platonic ideals, the Platonic forms, but he's seeming to understand this differently. Form is mentioned several times, but never with the lion, who is the Platonic ideal that has appeared. If you're wondering where the lioness is gone, it seems, and you'll notice this as we go through, that each time a Platonic ideal appears, it sort of sucks in all of the imperfect forms in the physical world into itself. The lioness has disappeared because the Platonic lion has appeared. Yeah, a little strange on that one, huh? And we are being told it seems to be coming from some other place. The original roar they hear is distant. It's far away. It's not a soft roar because the lion is being mild. The lion's simply not immediately there until it is. Now, all of this is happening. How is not really clear. Forms and shadows all mixed together, and suddenly we have this change, where the man is unconscious, the lioness is gone, and the lion has appeared. So there seems to be something else necessary. While the ideal has absorbed the lioness into it, it seems to be only the meeting between the lioness and Mr. Beringer that has brought this lion into being. But there seems to be something calling to everybody involved here, and that's what we need to address before we can discuss why the lioness has a perspective right at the beginning, or a possible reason. I don't know Charles Williams' head. I could be wrong. But everyone involved here seems to be caught in some sort of, well, how did they word it again? Pacing as if in a slow abstraction. He moved slowly and paused between each step, but steps and pauses were coordinated in a rhythm of which, even in that moment of strain, the two young men were intensely aware. Indeed, as Anthony watched, his own breathing became quieter and deeper, his tightened body relaxed, and his eyes, left turning excitedly towards the beach, crouched in the road. In Quentin no such effect was observable, but even he remained in an attitude of attention devoted rather to the man than to the beast. So the strange pattern remained until, always very slowly, the stranger came to the path down the garden and made one of his pauses in its midst, directly between the human and the animal spectators. And Anthony thought to himself, I ought to warn him, but somehow he could not. It would have seemed bad manners to break in on the concentrated silence of that figure. Quentin dared not. Looking past the man, he saw the lioness, and thought in hasty excuse, if I make no noise at all, she may keep quiet. And again, this seems to be a difference here. Quentin doesn't seem to be affected the same way Anthony is. But the man also seems to be affected by something, and the lion as well. In a previous section I read out, the lion continued the rhythmic pacing the man had been involved in. So the man stopping between the two men on the porch and the animal seems to denote that there is a connection in this moment. In fact, as they're standing here, the lioness, too, is focused on something. She is remaining quiet until a shout startles her, and she leaps the fence towards the man. Let's look again at our beginning. The few bits were told about the lioness. From the top of the bank, behind a sparse hedge of thorn, the lioness stared at the Hertfordshire road. She moved her head from side to side, then suddenly she became rigid, as if she had scented prey or enemy. She crouched lower, her body trembling, her tail swishing, but she made no sound. This then skips to Quentin and Anthony, and we're sort of assuming that the lioness likely heard them. I'm not so sure. There seems to be something that drew Mr. Beringer and the lioness together, and also seems to have drawn Anthony and Quentin here, though Anthony is the most affected out of the two. Quentin is startled and wants to run away. So the lioness, scenting something, might actually be this moment of platonic assent. This moment of coming together of Mr. Beringer and the lioness so the lion can appear in the world. The lioness seems to be starkly aware of this. She's unsure of what it is. She scents either prey or enemy, which mean very different things. She either scents something that will feed her or something that could hurt her. These two should usually be differentiated. So it makes us have to think whether or not the arrival of the Platonic ideals is a good thing. Has the lioness disappeared from existence? Or has she ascended and exists within the form, the ideal form, of the lion? Is this ascent something that should scare us or attract us? Should we be Quentin or Anthony? Well, it's a little hard to judge right now. We're only in chapter 1. But we're certainly intrigued. A lioness has disappeared and a lion has appeared in its place. But there's something strange about the lion. It is the Platonic ideal, not an actual lion that's appeared to us. So let's keep reading. Let's figure out if more Platonic ideals are going to appear and what just this might mean. As we go, though, we'll also have to watch Anthony and Quentin, Who has the right idea? Do we walk towards and meet the Platonic ideals? Or do we walk away and let them catch us? If they ever do. Like I said, I'm going to keep reading, and I hope you do too. See you next time.